Welcome back to the Dirt Diaries, explorers. Don't forget to hit subscribe so that you never miss a new archaeological find or new episode. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, don't forget to like, rate, comment, and more on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And if you're new here, hi, welcome. I hope you love ancient history, archaeology, mythology, mystery, and more as much as I do, because my name is Dr. Tenendra Kallenbarger and I bring the ancient world to you. Because no, this is not ancient aliens, this is the real thing, and these are the Dirt Diaries. And of course, a special shout out and hello to those lounging in the villa, perusing in the library, or snooping in the restricted section over on Patreon. And last time on Dirt Diaries, we searched through the reeds of the Nile and took a peek into the Egyptian pantheon itself and even the afterlife because we looked at hippos of ancient Egypt, mainly the most famous blue hippo of all time, William the Hippo. And at almost 4,000 years old, he's still as alluring as ever at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And per usual here at the Dirt Diaries, we're changing it up again, but keeping it tangentially related to Egypt. We're talking about one of the most expensive meals in history. A dinner that included the last queen of Egypt, one of the most famous men in ancient Rome, pearls, and more. So what do ancient writers have to say about this? What did artists depict? And why are we still talking about this over 2,000 years later? Well, we gotta talk the dinner of pearls. So who's who at this dinner party? Well, I kind of already spoiled a little bit of it, but let's go over a quick overview of who exactly was in attendance at this dinner party. So first up, we have, of course, Mark Antony, who at this point in history, when this is believed to have occurred, he was already having an affair with Cleopatra. For their relationship really began around 41 BCE, and of course, their relationship and allegiance to one another really continued until up to their deaths. And he already had children with her at this point. Together, yes, they did have 3 children together. They had a set of twins and then a younger son. And with the dating of, their relationship and when this dinner is believed to have taken place, we have speculations placing this dinner around 33-32 BCE. And a quick spark note addition to bring everybody up to speed, because we all probably know about Mark Antony, but I gotta talk about it just for a hot sec. So Mark Antony was a Roman politician and general, and in fact, little fun fact, he is related, or was related, I should say, to Julius Caesar. So after, his relative's assassination back in 44 BCE during the Ides of March, he of course joined forces with somebody who he would come to battle with later on, Octavian, later known as Augustus, along with others to defeat the killers of Caesar. And of course, bada bing, bada boom, things are done. And after this period, because it's still the Republic, the Republic was split amongst them and divided. So Mark Antony actually got the far eastern Mediterranean portion. And then the other person of interest at the dinner party is none other than Cleopatra VII. Yes, Cleopatra, as we know her in history, many just refer to her, of course, as Cleopatra. But if we're getting into the specifics of the Ptolemies, she's Cleopatra VII. So yes, there were 6 other Cleopatras in the Ptolemaic family tree or family bush, really, if you're looking at the lineage of everything. It's pretty crazy. And of course, prior to her affair with Mark Antony, she had already had a relationship with Caesar, which did result in an offspring. And so together, Julius Caesar and Cleopatra did have a son together. You may recall him from history, Caesarion. And of course, Cleopatra VII, she was the last ruler of Egypt. She technically was the last pharaoh of Egypt before Egypt became under Roman rule. And because of her position, she actually held an immense amount of power. She was extremely intelligent. She was literate, spoke multiple languages, including that of Egyptian, and all around was a real political powerhouse. She knew how to wheel and deal. She knew the game that she was playing, and she was good at it. She was up with the titans at her time, and She is just extremely fascinating to study and to learn about. And yes, one day we will deep dive onto who she was, her lineage, and more. Maybe go into the whole, Ptolemaic family tree because, wow. And really, she did everything in her power to save her people and her land at a time where she knew she likely was on borrowed time. Now, of course, this portion is really just kind of the short, sweet, and to the point Spark Note edition of who Cleopatra was and who the other attendants were at the dinner party. So we got to move on. And where was this taking place? Well, it's believed that this was actually taking place in Alexandria, which if you ever get a chance to go, it's utterly incredible. And since we're likely going to Egypt again next year, traveling together, I highly recommend staying a few extra days so that you can go and see it. You can see the new Library of Alexandria and, potentially where this dinner took place. So while it's believed to have the setting in Alexandria, we don't exactly have a specific place, a specific area there. Of course, it's believed to have taken place in the palace there, and perhaps the audience was really supposed to know already where this was taking place, or they were supposed to use their own understanding of Egypt to concoct an image on their own. Okay, so now on to the dinner. So gather round, everybody. Bring your finest beverage, bring your finest charcuterie board, and girl dinner, and hot beverages, cold beverages, a delicious, refreshing lemonade. Bring it all because we are going to have our own dinner party of sorts. So, in the accounts that we have about this dinner, we find that our Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, well, she arranged for a multi-day symposium to be held with her and all of her dining guests. And of course, every single day was to really encapsulate and emulate luxury, like the finest of luxury. And it was supposed to be lavished with gold and jeweled vessels. And around you, where the dinner was going to be occurring, these individuals would have been surrounded by beautiful art that would have cost a fortune. And it's believed that the walls as well would have been draped in purple. And side note, before we continue, is that if you know anything about ancient purple in the ancient world, is that one, it's a bitch and a half to make. Also extremely smelly. And fun fact, we actually do have Bronze Age evidence of purple dye workshops on the island of Crete, specifically on the island of Crissy. And secondly, for ancient purple, since we're in the 1st century BCE with Cleopatra, it was also still stupidly expensive. So much so that we actually have Roman writings denoting that if you were to dye a cloak purple, it would actually cost its weight in gold, which is crazy. Alrighty, moving on for the dinner party, because yes, we could sit in here and talk all about, the lavishness, and we are going to, but we got to move on. So she continues to invite her dinner guests with her to dine with her amongst the luxuries of her palace and more. Really wine and dine. And so every night she would outdo herself. So much so that from the first night, the vessels on the second night would very much overshadow those on the first night, even though those on the first night still cost an arm and a leg. But every night she was just bringing out the finest of fine and almost kind of playing it off as, oh, this old thing. And then right after being like, tee-hee, there's more. And of course, amping up the riches every single night. Because what are you to do if you are just going from finer metal, gold, jewel encrusted objects, all of this kind of stuff, purple drapery on the walls? How do you continue to outdo yourself, you might be wondering? Well, Cleopatra had this already planned, because on another night, she actually sent enough money out to purchase roses so that the floors of the dining room would be strewn with them. And if we think about modern money for roses, we can kind of use that. So already, if we think a dozen roses, how much is that, would you say? You can comment below what you think, but isn't it in the 30s or 40s, I would say, for a dozen long-stemmed roses? So if we're using that money, roses were expensive in the ancient world, and it was nothing to Cleopatra. So much so that it's believed that she actually distributed a whole talent's worth in order to achieve what she wanted, with all of the roses to line the floors with their beautiful petals and their intoxicating scent. So while Cleopatra was the hostess with the mostest, Antony, our buddy Antony, he was just enraptured in the rare foods. He was guzzling it down. He loved being surrounded by luxury and finery. So much so that he was just blown away each and every evening that he joined her. And it led to the point where he almost turns to her to ask, what more could you possibly do to make this better? How are you going to continue to outdo yourself, right? Because at some point you're going to hit a plateau. So how exactly would she make this more magnificent, more lavish, more expensive? Well, she still had an ace up her sleeve. And of course, not to be outdone or even show that his question affected her or anything, she simply replied to Mark Antony that she would use up 10 million sesterces over one dinner. And if you're wondering, how much does that equate to today? It's a great question, and I've done the math for you because I'm not going to leave you hanging here. So, 10 million? You say? 10 million? Well, that is roughly equivalent to over 1,700 pounds of gold. Which, what? And yes, I did the math because of course I did. I wasn't going to leave you guys not knowing how much over 1,700 pounds is going to equate to. So the final number, because I believe it was technically 1,764 pounds of gold. So punching in those numbers today to get a modern number, we would get specifically $42,745,000. That is what she was telling Mark Antony that she would be able to spend in one dinner. Absolutely insane. And, like anybody, I'll put my hand up. I wouldn't think it possible either. So our buddy Antony, well, he doesn't believe it. And really, how could you blame him? And because of the doubts that he had, he decided to turn it into something of his own favor. He decided to place a bet, which I love. I would probably do the same thing with my husband. So the bet was set for the next dinner. So the next night comes, the next dinner approaches, and the rare food is flowing, drinks are pouring, and he's looking around and is trying to really rack up the bill in his head to figure out how is she going to spend 10 million here tonight. He continues to locate, what would cost what in his mind, trying to tally up the opulence and more. That would have taken any normal person by surprise. But after looking around and everything and tallying up what he believed was everything for the night, he wasn't shocked at what he was seeing. He almost took an early celebration lap. He almost celebrated early. And he laughed before the final course was served. So Antony's sitting smugly. And, Cleopatra turned to him to simply give him the eyes along the lines of pish posh, wait. For this is truly only Act 1. This was simply the appetizer, my dear. We still have the whole night ahead of us. And even, went as far as to say to him, to his face, I, in fact, will consume 500,000 on my own out of the 10 million. And so dinner comes and goes. And for dessert, well, her servants simply placed a glass vessel in front of her. Also, the vessel type, little spark note addition, the vessel type may differ depending on the source and the translation that you're reading, and also how it's depicted later in art too. So just a little asterisk next to the vessel. So we know it's a vessel. Sometimes the material's up for debate. Anyway, so they put a vessel down in front of her, like a cup. And that's it. That's her dessert. But within it, this is where we get to the good stuff. In the vessel was vinegar. And what's really interesting is this night, for dinner, she, of course, was dressed in beautiful jewels, gems, and more. But tonight, she wore pearls in her ear, which it is actually said that being the last Egyptian queen, she actually had the two largest pearls in the entire world at that time, which is kind of crazy to think about, really, if you ask me. And these two largest pearls were rumored to have been gifted to her by other foreign kings. So Mark Antony's just kind of sitting at the dinner table, unclear of what's going on. He doesn't really put the pieces together until she unclasps one of these pearl earrings from her ears and drops it into her glass. And when it dissolved into her cup, she simply drank it. And it said that when she was done with that, she actually went to remove her second earring and was stopped by the man who was refereeing this entire bet. And at that point, when she was stopped, he instantly declared Mark Antony the loser. Now, while Cleopatra won in this instance here, of course, in a few years' time, she would ultimately lose against Rome. And the other pearl earring, you might be wondering, since she drank one and the other was still, saved by the referee at the tail end. What happened to that pearl, you might be wondering? Well, it said that after she was defeated, that other pearl was actually cut in half and then placed into the ears of the statue of Venus in Rome. And let's talk pearls of the ancient world. So specifically, how are pearls made? So gold and silver, of course, are mined from the earth. And of course, we do know where some ancient mines are actually located, which is so cool to know. But you can't really mine for pearls. In fact, pearls are created when an irritant lodges itself into the soft tissue of living mollusks. And of course, over time, it is then coated and layered by layers of nacre. But I should note that not every mollusk can, in fact, produce pearls. Now, in the ancient world, by the time that Cleopatra is around, so 1st century BCE, pearls were often found to adorn those who were royal. We see them in ancient portraits and were also associated with the divine, specifically with the goddess Aphrodite. For in her mythology, when she's born and walks onto the beach shore, it's said that the water that drips down her body actually then turns into pearls. So we're already having this divine connection to goddesses. And in Egypt specifically, Cleopatra was known to adorn herself with pearls and to strategically use them within her iconic representation. So prior to this, by the 2nd century BCE, pearls had become fashionable to wear with your attire for those who could afford it, especially in Rome. But Pliny notes that this fashion craze may have been introduced by Pompey after his victory over Mithridates, and that during his third Roman triumph that he received in 61 BCE, well, this triumph of his actually included a portrait of him rendered in pearls, which, of course, Pliny criticizes as having an ostentatious display. Now, not only does our boy Pliny have some words about Pompey and his ostentatious display of his pearled rendition of himself, but he also really just wasn't a fan of pearls, whether they were dangling from women's ears for them to hear as they walked, and even calls a certain instance of a woman wearing pearls and other gemstones as being a vulgar presentation. And he's specifically talking about the third wife of Caligula, Lolina Paulin. And wow, he has some words. Because for what he notes as supposed to being a modest engagement party, well, she arrives with emerald and pearls lining her neck, her hair, her head, her wrists, her fingers, her ears, and more, and was even said to have carried an actual receipt to show that they cost over 40 million sesterces. And speaking of pearls, I really wonder wonder if he would have had some words for me, because in my second piercing right now, I currently have little pink pearls that my husband got me as a graduation present for when I got my PhD. But I also wonder if Pliny would judge me because I have multiple piercings. Things that make you go, But, even before this, when Julius Caesar actually invaded Britain, he came across freshwater pearls that it said that he sometimes would weigh in his hand. But not everybody liked the pearls coming from the north, of course. That would be too easy. For Tacitus almost scoffs at them and denotes them as cloudy and livid blue, which I'm not too sure, but from that description, it still sounds very beautiful. So I don't know what Tacitus was on. And, his remarks don't stop there. He doesn't just stop at scoffing, because no, why would he? No, he continues on so far as trying to limit who can wear them, as in you can only wear them if you are of a certain position. You can only wear them if you are certain ages or anything. And then he tried to restrict them to only be worn on certain days. Wild. So it's safe to say pearls in the ancient world, while they had associations with mythology and the divine, they were really markers of status, power, and more. So now for the age-old question of, could this little parlor trick at dinner actually work with pearls? Or was it simply just a matter of belonging to legend? Well, we actually have some answers because people have been testing this out. And we also have a little bit of some hints from our ancient authors, because we actually have Pausanias, who writes that pearls could in fact be dissolved in vinegar, as they are mostly made up of calcium carbonate. And because of that, they are susceptible to breaking down in an acidic solution. So some scholars and scientists have actually put this age-old question to the test. So the testing for this incorporated a 5-carat pearl, and it was placed in white vinegar. So why white vinegar? It's actually because this would have been the most common vinegar in the Greco-Roman world. And the white vinegar that we have today is roughly 5% acetic acid, and with that would have taken about 24 to 36 hours to dissolve 1 gram. And the drink, the pearl concoction drink, well, it wouldn't have been the best, but it also wouldn't have been the worst, because as the pearl would have broken down in the vinegar, the pearl would have actually neutralized some of that acid, meaning the drink, after the whole pearl was done, would have actually been less vinegary. And this testing also dispelled the misconception of having a higher concentration of vinegar with the acetic acid, that would actually have sped up this entire process. Because nope, the more acetic acid that you have actually, turns out, slows down this reaction. But if vinegar is actually boiled and the pearl crushed, then the reaction would have taken less than 10 minutes. But for the pearl that we hear about in the story, well, it would have taken more than a day for it to fully break down. But the destroyed earring, the money spent, and the drink drunk is entirely plausible. It's also been speculated that with how intelligent Cleopatra was, she may have already softened the pearl of her earring prior to the dinner, and maybe even crushed it before she put it in her drink. Of course, to dazzle Mark Antony, not only with wealth and luxury, but with a little trick of the eye and a scientific trick. So what is the purpose of this story, or even what was the purpose of her consuming a pearl? And it was really to highlight and showcase the power and wealth of Egypt that she had at the edge of her fingertips. But of course, writers, both ancient and modern, will use this to villainize her and to demonize her as just a seductress who used wealth, power, and her body to get what she wanted. Whereas really, she was just an intelligent woman who knew how to play the game of politics and who knew how to play the Game of Thrones as good as the men on top. For she aligned herself with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony. And what's really interesting is when we see this image depicted in art, of course, later on in art history, it becomes a more historic piece that is meant to show wealth, luxury, and more. And these paintings, of course, later on in history, well, there's multiple of them. They will go by different names, such as the Banquet of Cleopatra, Cleopatra and the Pearl, the Feast of Cleopatra, all of that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, what's really interesting is within these art pieces, depending on the artist that you're viewing, we're seeing different iterations of the same scene going on. But at the end of the day, the climax of the scene is where Cleopatra reaches for her earring either from her ear and is ready to drop it into the cup. And depending on the art that you're viewing, Mark Antony's expression ranges from utter shock to not believing what's going on. The crowd around them will also change in how they are interacting. Sometimes people are not really paying attention, and the scene sometimes can be set outside to make it appear like they are in Egypt or to make it look ancient in that sense. But at the end of the day, the scene, the climax of the event of her dropping it into the cup also highlights how she was willing to break out of the mold of the Game of Thrones and what was currently going on in politics. And really, she was ready to throw out the playbook of social norms if that meant that she could prove a point, if that meant that she could best another person. And it is her cunningness and her cleverness and her utter intelligence that is one of the many reasons why we are still talking about this story today. And yes, I wanted to end or kind of do a look that was a little bit of a smoky eye with a red lip. And then, yes, I did put on a pearl necklace. Fun fact, this is my mom's. It's not mine. I need to give this back to my mom. It was something borrowed for my wedding. And it was also for my sisters as well. But she left from my wedding before me, so I had to travel back with it. So this will be going back to my mom Pilar back when I see her at Christmas. This was a super fun episode because I love trying to talk about, these legendary stories. Are they real? Have they been tested? I absolutely love that there has been testing on this. This is also such a prominent motif or visual narrative, I should say, in the realm of art history for what it's trying to do and what it's trying to convey. And I really love that as an art historian, and I could talk about that all day. We could rank, our top Cleopatra feasting portraits, and maybe we'll do that over on the Dirt Diaries Patreon together, dive in and rank some of these paintings of what's going on, who's doing what's the climax, what is Mark Antony doing, and rank what our favorite one is, because I think I have my favorite, but I don't want to spoil it here. But with that being said, if you want to come travel through ancient history and go to a site that is related to Cleopatra tangentially, because it's where her sister Arsinoe IV actually was exiled to after she backed the wrong family member and then was supposedly on the stairs of the Temple of Artemis where she was seeking sanctuary at the site of Ephesus in modern day Turkey. If you want to come see where history took place, that's related, of course, to the last queen of Egypt. Or if you want to come walk through ancient mythology, ancient mythological places, we are going to Turkey in May. When this episode comes out, I will actually be in either Turkey or Greece. I'm blanking on where I'm exactly going to be, but I'm actually visiting both in the upcoming weeks. So I will be showing you all behind the scenes videos about that over on social media. You can follow me over at the Dirt Diaries _ on both TikTok and Instagram, or of course on YouTube. You can subscribe to the .dirt.diaries because everything else was taken. But, if you want to see exactly where she came from in ancient Egypt, I am planning another Egypt trip for next year. It's likely going to be early fall, and by early fall, I mean early September. So come travel with me to Turkey. I know we already have some individuals signed up who are coming, who are teammates, so I'm super excited about that. And yeah, as always, keep your books open, stay curious, and I'll see you guys next time on the Dirt Diaries.